Blood washes away in the rain, but the smell of it always lingers. I didn't want to be a savior. Saviors get themselves killed in the lower wards. I just wanted to get my groceries home before the paper bag completely disintegrated in the downpour. But there he was, bleeding out against the brickwork, smelling of crushed pine and ozone, an alpha on the absolute edge of death. I should have kept walking. If I'd known who he really was, I would have. The rain in the lower district didn't cleanse anything. It just made the grime wet. It was coming down in sheets, a relentless gray wall that turned the cobblestones into slick ankle breakers. My boots leaked. The left one had a crack right across the sole, and freezing water squelched between my toes with every step. I had my arms wrapped tight around a disintegrating paper sack of bruised apples, half a loaf of stale bread, and a blister pack of black market suppressants that cost me a week's wages. I was tired. A bone-deep, marrow-sucking exhaustion that never really went away, just receded slightly after my third cup of bitter morning coffee. I turned down narrow Hawthorne Alley to cut 2 blocks off my commute. The street lamps here had been busted out weeks ago by local kids throwing spark plugs. It was pitch black, save for the ambient orange glow of the city bleeding through the smog above. That's when the smell hit me. It punched through the scent of wet garbage and damp brick. Sharp, oppressive. It smelled like a lightning strike in a pine forest, underscored by the heavy, unmistakable reek of hot copper. Blood, a lot of it, and underneath the blood, the distinct, suffocating pheromones of an alpha. My stomach clenched. Instinct, hardwired and ancient, screamed at me to turn around. An injured alpha was a cornered predator. Even half dead, they could snap an Omega's neck just in a blind territorial panic. I tightened my grip on my groceries. I took a step backward. The sole of my boot scraped against gravel. A ragged breath rattled from the darkness. A wet, tearing sound. Leave it, I told myself, the words barely a whisper over the drumming rain. Not your problem. Walk away, Kieran. I took another step back. Then, a low groan echoed from the pile of trash bags stacked against the brick wall. A hand, large and pale in the gloom, flopped out and splashed into a puddle. The fingers twitched, scraping uselessly against the wet stone. I stood there for a long time. The rain plastered my hair to my forehead. Water dripped down the back of my neck, cold as a knife blade. I hated myself in that moment. I hated the stupid, stubborn knot in my chest that refused to untighten. It wasn't compassion. Compassion was a luxury for the rich upper rings of the city. It was an annoyance. It was the irritating, nagging realization that if I walked away, the thought of this heavy, rattling breathing would keep me awake at 3 a.m. Idiot, I muttered. I set the groceries down on a relatively dry window ledge. I approached slowly, keeping my breathing shallow to avoid dragging too much of his distressed scent into my lungs. He was slumped hard against the brick. Big, broad shoulders encased in a heavy dark overcoat that was currently drinking up the alley water. His head was tipped forward, chin resting on his chest, rain sluicing through thick dark hair. I nudged his boot with mine. No response. I crouched down. The smell of pine and ozone was so thick here it made my eyes water. It made the base of my spine tingle, a humiliating biological response that I shoved down with a spike of anger. I reached out, my fingers brushing the collar of his coat. The wool was saturated. I pressed 2 fingers to the side of his neck. His skin was burning. The pulse beneath my fingertips was a frantic, erratic flutter, like a dying bird trapped in his throat. My fingers came away slick and dark. I let out a harsh breath, wiping the blood on my own jeans. The wound was somewhere in his side. He was bleeding out fast. "Hey," I said, slapping his cheek lightly. His skin was rough, dusted with stubble. "Hey, get up." Nothing. I grabbed him by the lapels of his heavy coat and hauled backward. The dead weight of him nearly pitched me forward into the mud. He was entirely muscle and dense bone. It was like trying to drag a wet mattress. He grunted, a low, guttural sound of pain, but his eyes didn't open. "Come on, you massive bastard!" I hissed through my teeth, getting my arms under his armpits. I heaved. My knees popped. My lower back screamed in immediate protest. I managed to drag him 3 feet before my grip slipped, and he slumped heavily back to the cobblestones. I stood over him, chest heaving, the rain washing the sweat from my face. This was a mistake. I should just go to the nearest payphone and call the city watch. Let them deal with a dying Alpha in the gutters. But I looked at the dark stain spreading rapidly across his shirt, mixing with the muddy puddle beneath him. He wouldn't last the 20 minutes it would take the watch to arrive. I cursed every god I could name. I grabbed my half-ruined groceries with one hand, shoved them into my deep coat pocket, and bent down again. I hooked my arms under his shoulders, locked my hands over his sternum, and leaned all my weight backward. Step, drag, step, drag. Every inch was a fight. The alley felt 10 miles long. The wet wool of his coat chafed against my forearms. His boots dragged over the stones with a sickening scraping sound. The physical exertion was making my own body heat rise, and I could feel the familiar, sickeningly sweet edge of my own scent starting to spike through my failing suppressants. Damp earth and crushed tea leaves. If he woke up now, if the alpha haze overtook him, and he registered an unbonded omega dragging him into the dark. I shoved the thought away. Step. Drag. By the time I reached the rusted iron door of my apartment building at the end of the alley, my lungs were burning battery acid. My hands were cramped into claws. I fumbled for my keys with numb, bloody fingers, dropping them twice in the darkness. I pushed the heavy door open, grabbed him by the collar, and hauled him over the threshold. My apartment was on the ground floor, thankfully. A cramped, single-room box that smelled faintly of mildew and cheap cooking oil. I kicked the door shut behind us, the heavy thud cutting off the sound of the rain. The silence in the room was immediate and oppressive, filled only by the ragged, wet rasp of his breathing. I dragged him to the center of the room, leaving a smeared trail of rainwater and blood across the scuffed linoleum, and let him drop onto the cheap, threadbare rug. I collapsed against the wall, sliding down until I hit the floor. I sat there for 3 minutes, just dragging air into my lungs. My hands were shaking. I looked at the man on my floor. Under the harsh, flickering fluorescent bulb of my kitchen alcove, he looked even worse. His face was bruised, a nasty cut splitting his bottom lip. But it was his clothes that caught my attention now. Up close, under the light, the coat wasn't just wool. It was a heavy tailored cashmere blend. The buttons weren't plastic. They were dull, solid metal, stamped with some intricate geometric design. The boots I had been dragging him in were leather, custom fitted, with a subtle, reinforced steel toe. Wealth. Serious, undeniable wealth. A cold spike of dread hit my stomach. Rich alphas didn't end up bleeding out in Hawthorne Alley by accident. They didn't get mugged by common street thugs. This was a hit, a targeted strike, and I had just dragged the evidence into my living room. I scrambled to my feet. Panic is a cold, clarifying thing. I needed to stop the bleeding, get him stable, and get him the hell out of here before whoever did this came looking for a corpse. I went to the bathroom and grabbed my meager first aid kit. Half a bottle of rubbing alcohol, a tube of cheap antibacterial ointment, some gauze, and a heavy pair of fabric shears. I knelt beside him. Up close, his scent was overwhelming. It clogged my sinuses, heavy with distress and aggression. It made my skin prickle. I breathed through my mouth to shut it out. I grabbed the hem of his heavy coat and tugged. He didn't budge. I ended up having to roll him onto his side, gritting my teeth as a fresh wave of blood soaked into my rug. I wrestled the coat off his shoulders. Underneath, he wore a dark dress shirt, now ruined and plastered to his skin. I didn't bother unbuttoning it. I took the fabric shears, jammed the lower blade under the collar, and cut straight down the middle. I pulled the wet fabric apart. The wound was on his left side, just below the ribs. It wasn't a bullet hole. It was a puncture and a tear, a knife wound driven in hard and twisted. Dark blood welled up steadily, pulsing weak but thick. Jesus, I breathed. I grabbed a fistful of cheap paper towels from the counter and pressed down hard on the wound. The alpha convulsed. His eyes stayed shut, but a guttural snarl ripped from his throat, a sound so deep it vibrated the floorboards. His heavy, blood-stained hand shot out and clamped around my wrist. The grip was agonizing. It felt like an iron vise snapping shut. I gasped, the bones in my wrist grinding together. "Let go!" I hissed, trying to yank my arm back, but he was immovable. Even unconscious, his strength was terrifying. His scent spiked, the pine and ozone turning burnt and acrid, flooding the small room with pure, unadulterated hostility. "I'm trying to help you, you stupid bastard," I ground out, leaning my body weight onto my left hand to keep the pressure on the wound, while my right wrist remained trapped in his grip. "Let go." He didn't. His breathing hitched, sweat beading on his pale forehead. He was burning up. Fever was already setting in, meaning the blade was dirty. I waited. I counted to 30. Slowly, as his body realized it didn't have the energy for a fight, his fingers loosened. I ripped my wrist away, rubbing the angry red marks blooming on my skin. I worked quickly after that. I poured the rubbing alcohol directly into the wound. He arched off the floor, a strangled, horrific sound ripping from his mouth. I pinned his shoulders down with my knees, throwing my weight over his chest to keep him from thrashing and doing more damage. The smell of the alcohol mixed with the copper of his blood and the sweat pouring off both of us. It was a miserable, suffocating combination. I packed the wound with gauze, my fingers slick and clumsy. I wrapped thick bandages around his torso, pulling them tight enough to restrict the bleeding. By the time I finished and tied the knot, my arms were trembling so badly I could barely form a fist. I dragged him again, over to my narrow bed in the corner of the room. It took everything I had left to heave him up onto the mattress. I pulled a thin, worn blanket over him. He looked entirely out of place in my dingy apartment. The expensive cut of his jaw, the sheer physical space he commanded even while unconscious. I went to the sink, turned on the tap, and scrubbed the blood off my hands with dish soap. The water swirled pink down the drain. I stared at it. I was in so far over my head. I took my black market suppressants out of my pocket, popped 2 dry, and swallowed them past the lump in my throat. I needed to ensure my own biology remained dead quiet. The last thing I needed was to go into preheat with an injured feral alpha in my bed. I pulled a hard wooden chair up to the side of the bed. I didn't sleep. I sat there in the dark, listening to the rain beat against the window, watching his chest rise and fall. Dawn in the lower district didn't arrive with sunlight. It arrived with a shifting of the gray smog from charcoal to ash. The rain had stopped, leaving behind the steady drip of water from the fire escapes and the distant metallic rumble of the elevated train. Inside the apartment, the air was stale. It smelled of dried blood, rubbing alcohol, and the heavy, lingering musk of the sleeping alpha. My neck had seized up from sleeping in the hard wooden chair. I rubbed the back of it, wincing at the sharp pain shooting down my spine. I checked on him. His breathing had evened out. The fever seemed to have broken sometime in the early hours of the morning. His skin was cool to the touch, and the sweat had dried on his forehead. He was still unconscious, his face slack and exhausted. I stood up, my joints popping. I needed coffee. Badly. While the ancient percolator sputtered on the rusted stove, I walked over to the pile of ruined clothes I had dumped near the door. I needed to figure out who he was, and if there was someone I could anonymously call to come collect him. I picked up the heavy overcoat. It was still damp, weighing nearly 20 pounds. I patted down the outside pockets. Nothing. No wallet, no keys, no identification. I turned the coat inside out to check the inner breast pockets. The lining was silk, dyed a deep bruised purple, and stitched into the fabric right over the heart was a heavy thread embroidery. It was subtle, meant to be seen only by those who knew what they were looking for. A silver falcon, wings flared, clutching a shattered sword in its talons. My breath stopped in my throat. The coffee percolator gave a loud, final hiss behind me, but I didn't hear it. I stared at the crest. My vision narrowed. The edges of the room went slightly dark. The silver falcon, the insignia of the royal guard. But not just any guard. The shattered sword meant the inner circle, the royal family itself. I dropped the coat like it was made of hot coals. I stepped back, my chest suddenly tight. I looked at the man in my bed, the dark hair, the broad, unforgiving line of his jaw, the sheer, overwhelming density of his alpha presence. The pieces clicked together with the sickening finality of a vault door locking. Bastian, Prince Bastian, the king's second son, the crown's executioner. The man whispered about in the lower wards with a mixture of terror and hatred. He was the one who authorized the brutal crackdowns on the striking factory workers last winter. He was the one who had cleared out the eastern slums with fire and riot shields. He wasn't just a rich alpha. He was the most dangerous man in the city, and I had just spent the night wiping his sweat and patching his wounds. A cold sweat broke out over my ribs. I needed to leave. I needed to grab whatever cash I had stuffed in my mattress, pack a single bag, and get on a train heading out of the city. If his enemies found him here, they would kill me. If his own royal guard found him here in the filthy apartment of an unregistered Omega, they would kill me just for the insult of it. I turned toward the closet to grab my duffel bag. Don't! The voice was like grinding stones, low, raspy from disuse and thirst, but it vibrated with an absolute unquestionable authority that pinned my boots to the floorboards. I froze. Slowly, I turned my head. Bastian's eyes were open. They were a pale, icy gray, like the winter sky before a blizzard, and they were wide awake. There was no grogginess, no confusion of a man waking from a fever dream. His gaze was sharp, calculating, and entirely lethal. He was assessing the room, the locked door, the cheap furnishings, and finally, me. The vulnerability of the unconscious man was gone, completely erased. Even lying flat on his back, bleeding into cheap bandages on a sagging mattress, he controlled the room. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. My suppressants were working overtime, but I could feel the cold sweat of pure instinctual fear breaking out on the back of my neck. He didn't move. He didn't try to sit up. He just watched me. "Where am I?" he asked. His tone wasn't a request. It was an interrogation. "The lower wards." I forced the words past the dryness in my throat. My voice sounded thin, reedy. I hated it. "Hawthorne Alley. You were bleeding to death in the trash." His eyes flicked down to his bare chest, registering the thick bandaging around his torso. He tested the mobility of his left arm, wincing slightly as the movement pulled at the stitches. He didn't show pain, just a flicker of mild annoyance. "You did this?" he asked, looking back at me. "I tried to stop the bleeding," I said, keeping my distance. I stayed near the door. I poured alcohol in it and wrapped it. That's all. Bastian stared at me. His gaze felt heavy, physical. He inhaled slowly through his nose. I watched his nostrils flare slightly as he tasted the air in the room. He was sorting through the smells, the rust, the mildew, the coffee, and me. I crossed my arms over my chest, a defensive posture I couldn't stop. I knew he was trying to catch my scent. I prayed the black market pills were holding up. "You're an Omega," he stated. Flat, factual. He didn't sound surprised. He sounded analytical. Masked. Poorly. My jaw tightened. Anger flared up, a hot, brief spark that momentarily burned away the fear. "It's what I can afford. And you're welcome, by the way, for not letting you die in a puddle." A ghost of a smirk touched the corner of his bruised mouth. It didn't reach his cold eyes. "You know who I am," he said. It wasn't a question. He had watched my reaction to the coat. He saw the duffel bag half pulled from the closet. "I know," I said, my voice dropping. "I know you're Bastian." "Prince Bastian," he corrected softly. The words carried a subtle, crushing weight. The air in the room seemed to grow thicker, his alpha pheromones beginning to saturate the space again, not with distress this time, but with dominance. A quiet warning. "Right," I muttered, refusing to look away from those pale gray eyes, even though my instincts were screaming at me to submit, to look at the floor. Prince Bastian, the butcher. The silence that followed was suffocating. I had crossed a line. "You didn't speak to royalty like that, let alone the man who commanded the city's military forces. I waited for the explosion. I waited for him to force himself off the bed and wrap his massive hands around my throat. Instead, he let out a slow, painful breath and let his head fall back against my cheap pillow. "You have a terrible sense of self-preservation, Omega," he murmured, staring at the cracked plaster of my ceiling. "My name is Kieran," I snapped. Bastian rolled his head to the side, looking at me again. The gray eyes were unreadable. "Well, Kieran, since you so graciously interrupted my death, you now have a problem. My only problem is getting you out of my apartment before my landlord comes for the rent." "No," Bastian said, his voice dropping lower, the timbre of it vibrating against my breastbone. "Your problem is that the people who put this knife in me are going to retrace my steps, and when they find out an Omega dragged me out of that alley, they won't just kill you, they will take their time taking you apart to find out where I went." My stomach plummeted. The anger evaporated, leaving only cold, hollow reality. "So," Bastian continued, his eyes locking onto mine, calculating and utterly ruthless, "you're going to help me get out of this city, or we're both going to die in this room." The silence in the room stretched until it felt brittle enough to snap. I stared at him, the cold reality of his words sinking into my bones like damp frost. He wasn't threatening me out of malice. He was stating a mathematical fact of his world. I was collateral. I looked at my half-packed duffel bag on the floor. I looked back at the prints bleeding on my cheap mattress. "Fine," I said. The word tasted like ash. I didn't wait for his response. I turned away, the adrenaline finally overriding the exhaustion in my muscles. I moved fast. I stripped my small pantry of anything calorie-dense and non-perishable. 3 cans of soup, a sleeve of stale crackers, a half-empty jar of peanut butter. I shoved them into the canvas bag. I grabbed my spare boots, 2 pairs of thick wool socks, and the last sheet of my suppressants. Behind me, the mattress springs groaned. A sharp, violently suppressed hiss of pain followed. I spun around. Bastian was sitting up. His face was the color of old parchment, a slick sheen of sweat coating his forehead. His left hand was clamped over his bandaged side, his knuckles stark white. The sheer physical effort of lifting his own torso had caused the scent of ozone in the room to spike sharply, a defensive, aggressive smell that made the hairs on my arms stand up. "Don't be an idiot," I snapped, dropping the bag. "You've lost half your blood volume. You're going to tear the stitches." "Stitches won't matter if we're found here," he grunted, swinging his heavy legs over the edge of the bed. His custom boots hit the linoleum with a dull thud. "Give me my coat." "Your coat is a neon sign screaming royal family. You're not wearing it." I went to my closet and pulled out a heavy dark gray canvas work jacket. It belonged to the previous tenant, left behind in a box of junk. It was thick, ugly, and entirely unremarkable. I tossed it onto the bed next to him. Bastian stared at the jacket like it was a dead rat. His lip curled slightly. "I am not wearing that. You're wearing that, or you're dying naked in my living room. Your choice." I turned my back to him, unearthing a faded black beanie from the bottom of my drawer. "Your face is on every government building in the upper rings. Down here, people mostly just know you by reputation, but if someone gets a good look at your jawline and that ridiculous aristocratic haircut, we're done." A low, vibrating growl rumbled in his chest. It wasn't a conscious sound. It was pure, biological alpha displeasure at being ordered around by an Omega. My own instincts flared, a sudden, heavy pressure in the back of my skull urging me to lower my eyes and apologize. I gritted my teeth and forced myself to look at him dead on. He didn't argue further. Slowly, painstakingly, he dragged his good arm through the sleeve of the canvas jacket. I walked over to the kitchen counter, poured the bitter, lukewarm coffee into a cracked mug, and held it out to him. "Drink it. It's terrible, but the caffeine might keep you upright for an extra 10 minutes. He took the mug. His fingers brushed mine. His skin was burning hot again. The infection was fighting the alcohol, and I wasn't sure who was winning. He downed the black sludge in one continuous swallow, not even wincing at the taste. "Where are we going?" he asked, his voice gravelly. "The old maintenance tunnels beneath the sunken district," I said, zipping the duffel bag closed. "They flooded a decade ago. The city abandoned them. The patrol guards don't go down there because the rot rots their boots. It's safe." "For how long?" "Long enough for you to give me a name of someone who isn't going to shoot me on sight, so I can call them to come scrape you off the floor." I threw the strap of the bag over my shoulder. "Can you walk?" Bastian stood. It wasn't graceful. His massive frame swayed dangerously, and he caught himself against the wall, his chest heaving. The gray eyes were clouded with pain, but the steel underneath was absolute. "Walk," he breathed, a grim, humorless smile touching his mouth. "Omega, I am going to march." We slipped out the back window of the apartment building. The alley was empty, smelling sharply of wet garbage and morning smog. The rain had ceased, but a thick, soupy fog had rolled in off the eastern canals, swallowing the tops of the dilapidated tenements. We moved slowly. We had to. Bastian was a physical monolith, but he was operating on sheer willpower. Every step he took was calculated, his right hand gripping the brick walls of the alleyways for support, while his left arm stayed rigidly pressed against his ribs. I walked a half step ahead of him, my eyes scanning the shadows. The lower wards were a living organism. You had to know its breathing patterns. Right now, it was the dead hour. The night shift workers were asleep, and the day shift hadn't crawled out of their beds yet. The only people on the streets were the ones looking for trouble. "Turn left here," I muttered, grabbing the rough fabric of his canvas jacket to steer him away from a main intersection. He stumbled slightly, his weight briefly crashing into my shoulder. He was incredibly heavy. For a second, his face was pressed against my neck. I felt his hot, ragged breath against my collarbone. His scent, pine, rain, and raw iron, enveloped me completely. My pulse hitched. My body reacted before my brain could stop it, a flush of heat rising in my chest. The suppressants were holding, but physical contact with a distressed alpha was a dangerous catalyst. He pulled back immediately, his jaw clenched tight. "Apologies," he rasped. "Save your breath," I whispered, rubbing my shoulder. 3 more blocks." We crossed into the sunken district. The pavement here was warped, buckling upward in jagged concrete waves. The street lamps were dead. The fog was thicker here, smelling of brackish water and decaying algae. Suddenly, the unmistakable hum of a patrol cruiser's engine vibrated through the fog, 2 streets over. The slow, sweeping drone of tires on wet asphalt. Bastian froze. His hand shot out, grabbing my upper arm with bruising force. "Patrol." "I hear it. Move." I dragged him toward a narrow gap between 2 condemned butcher shops. The space was barely wide enough for my shoulders, let alone his. We squeezed into the darkness, the smell of old blood and rot overwhelming. The cruiser turned the corner. The harsh, sweeping beam of its searchlight cut through the fog, washing the street in stark white. I pushed Bastian backward until his spine hit the brick wall. I stepped in right in front of him, pressing my body flat against his to keep us completely shadowed from the street. There was no space. My chest was crushed against his. I had to tilt my head up just to avoid suffocating against his collarbone. The air between us disappeared. The cruiser crawled past, agonizingly slow. The searchlight swept across the entrance of our alley. The bright beam illuminated the edge of Bastian's boot. I held my breath. My heart was slamming against my ribs so violently I was terrified the guards could hear it over their engine. Bastian was entirely still, but beneath the thick canvas of the jacket, I could feel the frantic, heavy thud of his own heart. His chin rested lightly on the top of my head. The heat radiating off him was immense. Fever was setting in hard. In the tight, dark space, the scent dynamics shifted. The aggressive ozone faded. The pine sap deepened, becoming thick, rich, and suffocatingly protective. It was a biological response to being cornered, the alpha instinct to shield whatever was in its immediate territory. And right now, I was in his territory. I closed my eyes, fighting the urge to lean into that heat. It was a lie. It was just biology. He didn't care about me. He just needed me to survive. The cruiser's engine faded down the block. The white light vanished, leaving us in the gloom. I immediately shoved backward, gasping for the damp, rotten air of the alley. They're gone. Bastian didn't move for a long second. He let out a slow, shaky breath. Your heart rate is erratic, he noted, his voice barely a whisper in the dark. I'm terrified of being executed in an alleyway, I shot back, adjusting the strap of my duffel bag with trembling hands. Let's go. The entrance to the tunnels is under the bridge. The maintenance tunnels were a labyrinth of rusted pipes, dripping water, and solid concrete. It was pitch black, cold enough to see our breath, and utterly silent except for the echoing drip of condensation. I led us using a small, dying flashlight, navigating by memory. 10 years ago, I used to hide down here when the local gang swept the upper blocks. Nobody came down here. The air was too thin, and the water was toxic. We reached a small, elevated pump room that sat above the water line. The heavy iron door screamed on its hinges as I forced it open. In here, I said, shining the weak light around. It was a concrete box, roughly 10 by 10 feet. There was a rusted metal desk shoved into one corner and a pile of rotting wooden pallets in the other. It was miserable, but it had 4 solid walls and a heavy deadbolt on the inside of the door. Bastian stumbled over the threshold. The adrenaline that had carried him across the city evaporated the second he realized we had stopped. His knees gave out. I dropped my bag and caught him under the arms before his skull could hit the concrete. We went down together in a tangled heap of limbs. Hey, I slapped his cheek lightly. His skin was scorching hot. Don't pass out on me now. Come on. He didn't answer. His eyes were rolled back, his breathing short and shallow. Panic, cold and sharp, flooded my veins. I dragged him over to the wooden pallets, kicking off the worst of the debris, and managed to roll him onto his back. I unzipped the duffel bag and tore out the first aid supplies. I ripped the canvas jacket off him, uncaring if I ruined the zipper. His shirt was soaked through with fresh blood. The walk had torn the stitches. The crude bandages I had applied were a ruined, soaked mess. Damn it, I swore, my hands shaking as I cut the bandages away. The wound was ugly. The edges were angry and red, radiating heat. I poured the last of the rubbing alcohol over it. Bastian violently convulsed, a choked roar tearing from his throat, but his eyes didn't open. The fever had completely taken him under. I packed it with fresh gauze and wrapped it tight, pulling the fabric until he groaned in his delirium. Once he was stable, I collapsed against the rusted metal desk, sliding down to the floor. I pulled my knees to my chest. The room was freezing, but Bastian was sweating through his clothes. I took one of my spare wool shirts, soaked it in a puddle of relatively clean condensation gathered on the iron desk, and pressed it to his forehead. Hours bled together. The silence of the tunnels was oppressive. I sat beside him, changing the cold compress, listening to the agonizing sound of his lungs fighting for air. Around what I guessed was late afternoon, a subtle, terrifying shift happened in the room. My skin began to prickle. A dull ache started at the base of my spine, radiating outward. My mouth felt dry. I fumbled in my pocket for my blister pack of suppressants. I popped one out and swallowed it dry. It scraped down my throat. I waited for the familiar numbing chill of the chemicals to wash over me. Nothing happened. The stress, the physical exhaustion, the constant overwhelming exposure to a distressed alpha's pheromones. My body was burning through the cheap black market pills faster than I could metabolize them. I looked down at my hands. They were trembling, but not from fear this time. The scent in the small concrete room began to change. Underneath the heavy, oppressive smell of Bastian's fevered pine and ozone, a new scent began to thread its way through the cold air. Damp earth, crushed black tea leaves, sweet, heavy, my own scent, unmasking. On the pallets, Bastian shifted. His head rolled to the side. The fever dream seemed to break for a fraction of a second. His chest expanded as he took a deep, shuddering breath through his nose. His eyes snapped open. The pale gray irises were blown wide. The pupils dilated until they were almost entirely black. He looked straight at me. The calculating prince was completely gone. The man looking at me was pure, unfiltered instinct. Omega, he breathed, the word a ragged, hungry scrape against the silence. The air in the concrete room turned into molasses. Every breath I took felt thick, heavy with the cloying, inescapable scent of my own biology betraying me. Damp earth and crushed black tea. It rolled off my skin in waves, a chemical broadcast of vulnerability that cut right through the freezing dampness of the pump room. Bastian didn't just look at me, he locked onto me. The fever had stripped away the prince, the tactician, the cold aristocrat. What remained on the rotting wooden pallets was a predator operating on millions of years of hardwired, inescapable instinct. His pupils eclipsed his irises. The muscles in his jaw worked, his teeth grinding together with a sound like rocks crushing. He moved. It wasn't a smooth, calculated movement. It was a violent, jerky spasm of raw need. He rolled onto his side, his good arm pushing his heavy torso off the floor. "Stop!" I said. My voice cracked. It didn't sound like a command. It sounded like prey. Bastian let out a sound that wasn't human. It was a low, resonant rumble that vibrated against the rusted metal of the desk beside me. He dragged himself forward, closing the distance between us by an agonizing foot. Blood immediately began to bloom fresh and bright red against the white gauze wrapped around his ribs, but he didn't even seem to register the pain. My spine hit the edge of the metal desk. There was nowhere to back up. "I said stop!" I shouted, the panic finally breaking through my chest. I scrambled my hand across the top of the desk, my fingers blindly searching the debris until they closed around a heavy, rusted iron pipe fitting. It weighed maybe 5 pounds. I gripped it with both hands and held it up like a club. "Stay down, Bastian," I warned, my chest heaving. The tea leaf scent of my preheat was spiking, making my own head spin. A deep, heavy pressure was building at the base of my spine, an instinctual urge to lower my head, to bare my throat, to submit to the overwhelming wave of pine and ozone flooding the room. I bit down on the inside of my cheek until I tasted copper. The sharp pain grounded me. Bastian paused. He was on his hands and knees, swaying slightly. The heavy canvas jacket hung off his massive frame. He stared at the rusted iron fitting in my shaking hands. He didn't look threatened. He looked confused, as if a rabbit had suddenly turned and bared its teeth at a wolf. "Omega," he breathed again. It was a demand, a gravitational pull. He lunged. He was incredibly fast, even half dead. His hand shot out, his thick fingers wrapping entirely around my left ankle. I screamed. Not a dignified sound. A raw, terror-filled shriek. I didn't swing the pipe at his head. Some lingering, idiotic sliver of self-preservation stopped me from braining the king's son. Instead, I brought the heavy iron down hard on his knuckles. Metal hit bone with a sickening crack. Bastian roared, a sound of absolute fury, but his grip didn't loosen. Instead, he jerked his arm backward, yanking my leg out from under me. I hit the concrete floor hard. The back of my skull bounced against the stone, sending a blinding flash of white light behind my eyes. The air punched out of my lungs. Before I could drag a breath back in, Bastian was over me. His weight was crushing. He pinned my legs with his knees, his massive chest hovering inches above mine. The heat radiating off him was like an open furnace. The smell of his fevered sweat, the metallic tang of his blood, and the oppressive, aggressive ozone of his alpha scent swallowed me whole. I dropped the pipe. My hands flew up, pressing flat against his broad chest, trying desperately to keep his weight off me. It was like trying to hold up a collapsing building. "Shh, get off," I gasped, squirming uselessly beneath him. He didn't hear me. His face dipped down, burying his nose into the crook of my neck, right over my scent gland. He inhaled sharply, a wet, desperate sound. The rough stubble on his jaw scraped painfully against my sensitive skin. A violent shiver ripped down my spine, entirely against my will. My body was trying to surrender to the pheromones, to melt into the heat of him, while my mind screamed in pure panic. He opened his mouth. I felt the heat of his breath, the damp slide of his tongue against my pulse point, and then the scrape of his teeth. "Bastion!" I screamed, slamming the heels of my hands up into his shoulders with everything I had left. The physical jolt, combined with the extreme torque of him leaning over me, did what my strength couldn't. The torn muscle and shredded tissue in his left side finally gave way. A horrific tearing sound came from his torso. Bastion froze. The feral haze in his eyes shattered like cheap glass. He jerked upward, tearing himself away from my neck. He let out a harsh, suffocated gasp, his back arching sharply as absolute agony short-circuited his brain. He rolled off me, collapsing onto the concrete next to my legs. He curled into a tight, trembling ball, his hands clamped over the soaked, ruined bandages. He couldn't even scream. The pain had stolen the breath from his lungs. I scrambled backward, crab-walking across the floor until my back slammed against the cold, damp concrete wall. I pulled my knees to my chest, wrapping my arms around them, shaking so violently my teeth chattered. I touched my neck. There was a wet patch of saliva and a red, angry mark where his teeth had scraped the skin, but the skin wasn't broken. He hadn't bitten me. He hadn't claimed me. I sat there in the dark, watching the most dangerous man in the city writhe on a filthy floor in a puddle of his own blood. The silence returned, broken only by his ragged, wet gasps and the steady drip of the condensation. The heavy scent of my unmasked Omega nature still filled the room, but the oppressive, terrifying weight of his alpha dominance had collapsed into the sour, metallic reek of pure pain. We stayed like that for hours. I didn't move to help him. I couldn't. I just watched him bleed, calculating exactly how long it would take for him to die, and whether I would feel anything but relief when he did. The fever broke exactly at the moment the battery in my cheap flashlight died. The room plunged into absolute, impenetrable darkness. I had spent the last several hours listening to the erratic, terrifying rhythm of his breathing, waiting for it to stop. It hadn't. Now, in the pitch black, the sound shifted. The wet, rattling gasps smoothed out into a shallow, exhausted rhythm. The suffocating heat in the small room began to dissipate, replaced by the bone-deep chill of the underground. "Are you still there?" The voice came from the darkness across the room. It was weak, threadbare. The grinding stones had been worn smooth by exhaustion, but the terrifying feral edge was gone. The prince was back in his own head. I didn't answer immediately. I swallowed dryly, my throat feeling like sandpaper. "I'm here." I heard the rustle of the canvas jacket as he tried to shift his weight. A sharp hiss of indrawn breath followed. "Don't move," I said, my voice flat. "You tore the stitches. You've bled through the gauze again. If you keep moving, you're going to empty your veins onto this floor, and I am not dragging your corpse out of here." Silence stretched between us. It wasn't the volatile silence of before. It was heavy, weighted with the memory of what had just happened. "My apologies," Bastion said quietly into the dark. I let out a harsh, bitter laugh. It echoed off the concrete walls. "Your apologies, right. That fixes everything. A royal pardon for almost ripping my throat out. It was biological. I was compromised by the fever." "I don't care what it was," I snapped, the anger finally overriding the lingering terror. "You don't get to explain it away with biology. Down here, when an alpha loses control, an omega ends up dead in a gutter. I don't care about your fever. I care that you're a liability." "I am aware." The cold, factual tone of his voice was infuriating. "You have unmasked. You are entering preheat. The environment is unstable." "The environment is you," I spat. "My suppressants failed because of the stress of hauling your massive dying ass across the city and hiding you from your own guard. Don't analyze me like a tactical problem." A long beat of silence, then a slow, rasping exhale. "You did not hit me," Bastion said. "When I grabbed you, You had a weapon. I heard it hit the floor. You struck my hand, but you did not strike my head. Why? I rested my forehead on my knees in the dark. Because I'm a coward. Because if I killed the king's son, I'd spend the rest of my very short life being hunted by your brother's assassins. A pragmatic coward, then, Bastian murmured. It sounded strangely like a compliment. Pragmatism keeps you alive in the lower wards. Money keeps you alive in the lower wards, I corrected him bitterly. Something you have never had to worry about. I am worrying about it now. We need extraction. There is no we. I need you gone. Kieran. Hearing him say my name in the dark made the hair on my arms stand up. It wasn't a threat. It was a recognition. I cannot walk, Bastian stated plainly. The blood loss is too severe. The infection has receded, but the tissue damage is extensive. If I attempt to leave this bunker, I will not make it to the surface. Then what are you suggesting? I leave you here with a juice box and wait for you to heal? I'm suggesting you go to the surface for me. I froze. No, absolutely not. The streets are swarming with patrol cruisers looking for you, or the people who put that knife in you. If I get caught, you won't get caught. You are an anonymous face in a city of millions. I heard the rustle of fabric again. In the inner pocket of my coat, the heavy wool one you left in your apartment, there is a small waterproof cylinder. I didn't bring your coat. It was covered in blood and the royal crest. I know. I need you to go to a public comms line, not a registered one, a black market splice line. Dial a specific sequence. Someone will answer. You will tell them... He paused, his breathing hitching. You will tell them that the Falcon has grounded in the rust, and you will give them these coordinates. Are you insane? I stood up, my boots scraping against the concrete. You want me to walk into the heart of the black market, unmasked, smelling like a walking preheat, and make a phone call to the Royal Guard? Not the Guard, my personal detail. They are untraceable. It's a death sentence, Bastian. It is our only option, he countered, his voice hardening, slipping back into the authoritative timbre of a military commander. If we stay here, I die of sepsis, and you die when whoever is hunting me inevitably sweeps these tunnels. You have a window. The smog is thickest before dawn. Go now. Make the call. Bring them here. And what do I get out of this suicide mission? I asked, my hands balled into fists at my sides. You get your life back, Bastian said quietly. And you get my word that you will be compensated. Enough to buy your way out of this district. Enough for proper suppressants for the rest of your life. I closed my eyes. The dark of the room was identical to the dark behind my eyelids. I hated him. I hated his arrogance, his assumption that my life was a chess piece he could move around to secure his own survival. But I also knew he was right. We were trapped. Give me the number, I said softly. Bastian recited a string of 10 digits. I repeated them back, burning them into my memory. The Falcon has grounded in the rust, Bastian repeated. Tell them Hawthorne Sunken District, Pump Station 4. Do you have a weapon? A folding knife, 2 inches. Keep it in your hand. Do not let anyone corner you. I walked toward the heavy iron door. I hesitated, my hand on the rusted deadbolt. I looked back into the pitch black of the room. I couldn't see him, but I could smell him. The ozone was faint, overpowered by the smell of blood and damp concrete. If I don't come back, I said to the darkness, it's because I'm dead. If you don't come back, Bastian replied, his voice devoid of any comfort or pity, I will be right behind you. I threw the deadbolt. The metal shrieked. I stepped out into the freezing, dripping labyrinth of the tunnels, leaving the wounded Alpha behind. The climb to the surface was an agonizing test of endurance. My legs shook with exhaustion, but the raw, unmasked tea leaf scent clinging to my clothes was a far more urgent problem. I kept to the shadows, moving through the flooded access corridors until I found a rusted iron ladder leading up to a street-level storm grate. I pushed the grate up. It was heavy, grating loudly against the concrete. I hauled myself over the lip and onto the uneven pavement of the sunken district. It was raining again. Not the heavy downpour of the night before, but a fine freezing mist that cut right through my thin shirt. The smog was thick, yellowing the faint glow of the few working street lamps. The streets were dead quiet, but it was the kind of quiet that felt like holding your breath. The nearest black market splice line was 4 blocks away, hidden in the back of a 24-hour mechanized laundry that fronted for a chop shop. I walked fast, my head down, my hands jammed into my pockets, my right hand gripping the small, useless folding knife. The rain helped dampen my scent, but every time the wind shifted, I could smell the sickeningly sweet earthiness of my own biology. I felt exposed, naked. I reached the laundry. The neon sign above the door sputtered, buzzing like an angry hornet. The front room was empty, smelling of cheap detergent and ozone. I pushed through the swinging doors at the back, stepping into the dim, oily corridor that smelled strongly of industrial grease and stale smoke. At the end of the hall, mounted on a peeling plaster wall, was the comms unit. It was a heavy retrofitted box with a battered metal keypad. I picked up the receiver. It was sticky. The dial tone was a harsh, broken static. I punched in the 10 digits Bastian had given me. The line clicked. Once. Twice. Then dead silence. No ringing. Just the heavy, empty sound of an open connection. "Speak," a voice said. It wasn't automated. It was human, female, and utterly devoid of inflection. My heart hammered against my ribs. "The Falcon has grounded in the rust," I rushed out, my voice shaking slightly. "Hawthorne Sunken District, Pump Station 4. The line disconnected. A sharp click, and then the dial tone returned. I slammed the receiver back onto the hook. I spun around, ready to sprint back to the tunnels. A heavy hand planted flat against the center of my chest, shoving me backward into the plaster wall. The impact knocked the wind out of me. Well, look what washed up." There were 2 of them. Local enforcers for the Iron Syndicate, the gang that ran the Sunken District. They were big, heavily augmented with cheap cybernetics, and they stank of cheap alcohol and stale sweat. The one who had shoved me leaned in. His eyes were entirely black, the irises replaced by basic optic lenses. He took a deep breath, his nostrils flaring. "Unmasked Omega," he grinned, revealing a row of metal teeth. "Wandering around our territory at 4 in the morning and smelling so sweet. You lost, little rabbit?" Panic, cold and sharp, flooded my veins. I tightened my grip on the knife in my pocket, but I knew it was useless. They would break my arm before I could even flick the blade open. "I'm just doing laundry," I lied, my voice remarkably steady despite the terror vibrating in my bones. "Let me pass. Laundry's closed," the second enforcer grunted, moving to block the hallway completely. "But we got a private room in the back. We can wait out the rain." He reached for me, his massive, scarred hand aiming for my shoulder. I didn't think. I reacted with pure street rat desperation. I didn't pull the knife. I brought my knee up as hard as I could, aiming squarely for the first enforcer's groin. He didn't have cybernetics there. He folded in half with a choked gasp. I shoved past his collapsing bulk, throwing my shoulder into the second man. The surprise of the attack bought me a fraction of a second. I broke past him, sprinting down the greasy hallway, bursting through the swinging doors into the laundromat, and shattering the front glass door with my shoulder as I hit the street. I didn't stop running. I tore down the alleys, my boots slipping on the wet cobblestones, my lungs burning battery acid. I heard heavy footsteps behind me, angry shouts echoing in the fog, but the fear pumped pure adrenaline into my veins. I reached the storm grate, practically threw myself down the concrete shaft, and dragged the heavy iron grate back into place, just as a shadow rounded the corner above me. I didn't wait to see if they saw me. I half climbed, half fell down the rusted ladder, my hands tearing open on the rough metal. I hit the flooded floor of the tunnels and ran blindly in the dark, navigating by touch and memory until I slammed into the heavy iron door of the pump room. I threw the deadbolt and collapsed against the door, sliding down to the wet concrete floor. I couldn't breathe. My chest heaved, pulling in huge, agonizing lungfuls of air. You're bleeding. Bastian's voice came from the dark. He hadn't moved from the pallets. Cut my hands on the ladder. I gasped out. I made the call. They answered. I think I led the local syndicate right to us. Silence. Then a low, rasping sigh. Come here. I'm fine by the door, I ground out, wrapping my torn hands in the hem of my shirt. Kieran, come here. It wasn't a request. I pushed myself up, my legs trembling violently. I walked blindly across the dark room until the toe of my boot hit the wooden pallet. I sank down onto the concrete beside him. In the dark, his large, hot hand found mine. His fingers were rough, calloused, but his touch was surprisingly gentle. He traced the ragged cuts on my palms. His alpha scent, still threaded with pain but no longer feral, wrapped around me. It didn't feel oppressive this time. It felt like a heavy protective blanket. We sat there in the dark, the sounds of the dripping water counting down the minutes. An hour later, the heavy iron door didn't creak. It simply blew inward with a deafening metallic screech. The lock shattered. Harsh, blinding white tactical lights flooded the room, pinning us in the corners. I threw my arms over my eyes, blinded. 4 figures moved into the room with terrifying, silent efficiency. They were clad in matte black armor, carrying heavy, suppressed weaponry. They didn't shout. They didn't ask questions. 2 of them immediately moved to Bastian, dropping to one knee beside him. One began opening a sleek medical kit. The other spoke rapidly into an encrypted comms unit. Status! A woman's voice barked. Severe laceration. Internal hemorrhaging. Sepsis is taking hold. He needs a surgical suite 10 minutes ago. One of the medics reported, swiftly cutting away the bloody canvas jacket I had put on him. The third guard, massive and holding a rifle at the low ready, turned toward me. The blinding light on his helmet pinned me against the wall. I saw his head tilt slightly as the unmasked tea leaf scent hit his filters. We have a civilian, the guard announced, his voice muffled by a tactical mask. Omega, unregistered, appears hostile. He raised the barrel of the rifle, pointing it squarely at my chest. Hands where I can see them. I froze, raising my bloody hand slowly into the air. This was it. They weren't going to leave witnesses, the prince's dirty secret, buried in the rust. Stand down, Rowan. Bastian's voice was weak, but the absolute crushing authority in it made the guard freeze instantly. The rifle lowered a fraction of an inch. Bastian pushed the medic's hands away, forcing himself into a sitting position. He looked terrible. His skin was gray, his lips entirely bloodless, but his pale eyes burned in the harsh tactical lights. He looked at the guard. Then he looked at me. He is under my protection, Bastian stated. The words rang off the concrete, heavy and final. You will not touch him. You will not record his presence. The guard hesitated, then nodded sharply, lowering the weapon completely. The medics moved in again, lifting Bastian onto a portable stretcher. As they hoisted him up, moving quickly toward the shattered door, Bastian reached out. His hand caught my wrist. His grip was weak now, failing, but his eyes were locked onto mine. The debt is recorded, Kieran, he murmured, his voice barely audible over the rustle of armor and heavy boots. I do not forget. He pressed something into my palm, folding my bloody fingers over it. Then they were gone. The tactical lights vanished, leaving me alone in the dim gray light filtering through the open doorway. The oppressive, heavy scent of pine and ozone faded rapidly, leaving behind the smell of burnt gunpowder and old blood. I stood in the silence of the empty pump room. I slowly opened my hand. Resting in the center of my torn palm, stained with my own blood, was a solid silver button. Deeply engraved into the metal was a falcon, wings flared, clutching a shattered sword. I closed my fist around it. The metal was cold. I knew with a sickening certainty that the rain hadn't washed anything away. It had only just started. Wow, what a high-stakes escape. Kieran surviving the streets only to end up holding the prince's crest changes everything. If you loved the gritty tension and that intense final moment between Bastian and Kieran, please hit the like button to support the channel. Share this with your friends who need a new, grounded Omegaverse addiction. And most importantly, subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next video. Will Bastian keep his word? Will Kieran be hunted? Drop your theories in the comments below, and I'll see you in the next chapter.